She thought she had won. Her husband's mistress smiled at his wife until her own husband entered the room. Watch until the end to find out what happened next. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The evening air in Atlanta had a gentle weight to it, thick with spring warmth and scented faintly of jasmine, drifting from the manicured hedges lining the perimeter of the Carver Arts Foundation. The gala fundraiser was in full swing, laughter blending with the soft clinking of glasses and the hum of chamber music curling through the marble corridors of the venue. Selina Harris stood poised near the entrance to the West Gallery, her long emerald gown clinging perfectly to her tall, graceful frame. Her curls were pinned high, her makeup subtle, and her expression a portrait of calm control. At 38, she had built the kind of life people whispered about with admiration and envy. Founder and managing partner of one of Atlanta's fastest-rising legal firms, a guest lecturer at Emory, and a name respected in both legal and philanthropic circles. But there was a loneliness in her eyes, carefully masked by success. For all her achievements, her brownstone in Ansley Park, the Porsche she drove sparingly, the invitations to exclusive boards, Selina had begun to accept that love, at least the real kind, might not be part of her narrative. Relationships had come and gone, some sincere, others predatory, but none had survived the full weight of her independence. Men admired her accomplishments until they realized she did not need them, not in the way they wanted to be needed. She sipped from a flute of champagne, her attention flicking across the room, registering familiar faces with detached interest. Judges, lobbyists, community leaders, all orbiting one another in the same predictable dance. She had attended these events so many times that the rhythm of it felt automatic. The only surprise of the evening came when her eyes landed on the man leaning casually against one of the gallery's columns, sipping his drink with the unbothered air of someone who knew he didn't quite belong, but also didn't care. He was younger, she could tell even from a distance, perhaps early 30s. His suit was sharp but not expensive, chosen with an eye for fit rather than designer labels. His skin was deep brown, his jaw square and clean-shaven. When their eyes met, he didn't avert his gaze as others often did when encountering her direct stare. Instead, he tilted his head in acknowledgement, the corner of his mouth lifted into a smile that felt more like a dare than a greeting. He approached with the confidence of someone used to navigating rooms where he was an outsider. There was no deference, no awkward small talk. "You don't look like you're enjoying yourself," he said smoothly, holding her gaze. His voice was warm, touched with a husky note that made her pause. "I rarely do," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. He grinned. "Then why come?" "Obligation." "Ah," he said, nodding. "You must be one of the important ones." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "And you?" "Just here to watch the important ones," he said. "I'm Darius Bell." "Selina Harris." His eyes flickered with recognition. Not the fake, exaggerated kind, but a subtle shift that told her he'd heard the name before. "The attorney," he said. She inclined her head. "Among other things." Their conversation flowed easily, moving from the sterile territory of event chatter to more personal reflections, on art, on the performative nature of fundraisers, on Atlanta's rapidly changing skyline. He didn't ask her about her money. He didn't try to impress her with credentials he didn't have. He was funny, but not showy, charming, but not rehearsed. There was a lightness to his presence that disarmed her. Over the following weeks, their encounters multiplied. He invited her to an exhibit opening, then to a jazz set at a hole-in-the-wall lounge she'd never noticed. He spoke of dreams, not accomplishments, his desire to launch a creative consulting firm, his past work in marketing, his upbringing in College Park. He was honest about his struggles, but framed them with a resilience she found admirable. For the first time in years, Selena found herself relaxing into someone. She didn't feel the need to present or protect. Darius had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen, not as a trophy or a challenge, but as a woman with soft places that had long gone untouched. Her friends were cautious. Her sister, Camille, was outright skeptical. "He's young," Camille said bluntly one evening over dinner, "and broke. What does he want with a woman like you?" "Maybe I'm the one who wants," Selena replied evenly. Camille shook her head. "You've worked too hard to let someone coast on your legacy. I'm not naive. I didn't say you were, but you're lonely, and sometimes that makes us lower our guard." But Selena didn't feel like her guard was lowered. She felt alive. And when Darius proposed 6 months into their relationship during a quiet weekend in Asheville in a cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge, she said yes without hesitation. There was something almost defiant in her acceptance, as though she were claiming the right to joy that the world rarely afforded women like her. Still, even in her exhilaration, she insisted on a prenuptial agreement. She framed it gently, lovingly, presenting it as a matter of mutual respect and protection. Darius didn't argue. If he was insulted, he didn't show it. He signed without protest, kissed her hand, and said, "Whatever helps you feel safe." They married in early autumn. The ceremony was held in a garden in Savannah, under a canopy of Spanish moss. Friends and colleagues flew in from all over the country. The photos were elegant, the smiles real. For a time, everything felt right. They settled into married life in her home. Darius adjusted easily, or so it seemed. He cooked, hosted small gatherings with ease, charmed her professional peers. He called her boss lady, with affection, not resentment. His business began to take shape with her help. She introduced him to clients, helped with incorporation papers, offered guidance without micromanaging. And yet, a year into their marriage, Selena began to notice things. Not large shifts, but subtle undercurrents. Darius was spending more time on his phone, replying to messages she couldn't see. His attention, once laser-focused on her, began to scatter. He missed a few dinners, made vague excuses. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She told herself that all marriages settle, that ambition could distract, that perhaps she had become too watchful, too sensitive. But one night, as he sat across from her at their marble dining table, laughing at something on his screen, she felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Something was changing. Something she couldn't name, but could feel growing like a crack beneath paint. She smiled back at him, raised her wine glass, and told herself it was just fatigue. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "You chose this man, and now you will see what that choice costs." The first year of marriage passed in a golden blur. Darius seemed to flourish in the orbit of Selena's life, welcomed into rooms where his name alone would have once gone unnoticed, now greeted with handshakes, claps on the back, and approving smiles from men who had been her peers and were now his by extension. Selena, ever generous, took quiet satisfaction in his success. She watched him build his agency, Bell Creative, from a single laptop in their guest room into a boutique firm with clients in fashion, wellness, and entertainment. He spoke with excitement about brand storytelling and visual identity, and when his face lit up in meetings, She felt proud to have supported him. But even as his presence expanded in the professional world, something intimate began to recede. At first, it was subtle, the way he pulled away just a second too soon during a kiss, or how his hand no longer sought hers during the late-night drives home. Their conversations, once layered with meaning and curiosity, started to flatten. He grew vague about his schedule, about new clients she'd never heard of. Sometimes she'd ask who he had met with that day, and he'd wave it off with a quick, just a guy from a studio downtown or someone from the app scene. Always someone, never a name. Selena was not a suspicious woman by nature. Her mind was trained to seek facts, patterns, evidence, but in matters of the heart, she had long ago learned to trust intuition, and hers, though silent at first, had begun to speak more frequently. The first real fracture came during a Sunday brunch they hosted in their backyard. Selena had invited a group of fellow attorneys. Darius had called in a few creative friends, and the atmosphere was relaxed, elegant, well curated, exactly the kind of gathering they had become known for. She noticed a moment during dessert when Darius received a message on his phone. He read it, and for just a flash, something crossed his face, a softness, a smile that wasn't for anyone in the room. Then, quickly, he locked the screen and tucked the phone under the table. She said nothing, but she remembered. 2 weeks later, she heard him speaking in hushed tones late at night from the sunroom. His voice carried, not in words, but in tone. Gentle, flirtatious, and most of all, secretive. When she stepped into the hallway, he fell silent. She entered the room a minute later, and he was on his laptop, pretending to be immersed in a deck presentation. "Couldn't sleep," he said without looking up, "trying to knock this out before morning." She nodded. Her heart ached, not from certainty but from possibility. What she feared was still fog, shapeless and floating, but she could feel it curling around her feet. The name came soon after. Grace Walton. They met, according to his explanation, at a wellness branding event in Midtown. She was a graphic designer, I think, or maybe in PR. His tone was deliberately casual. "We were just talking about campaign aesthetics. You know, the whole minimal but luxe look. She had a few smart takes." Selena smiled tightly. It was always the smart ones who posed the greatest threat. Darius began referencing Grace more often, slipping her name into anecdotes and to feedback about logos and storyboards. "Grace thinks this font reads cold," or "Grace suggested we lead with the human angle." Then came the business dinners that ran late, the weekend strategy sessions, the out-of-town networking retreats. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving her outright. It was worse than that. He had started loving someone else differently, excitedly, recklessly, and Selena, for all her composure, felt it. The way his clothes began to change, slightly trendier, more fitted, more deliberate. The way he shaved twice on the days he said he'd be meeting Grace. The subtle scent of a new cologne that lingered on his collar when he returned late at night. She even noticed the way he began curating their home differently, swapping their art prints, suggesting new lighting, bringing in modern pieces that spoke more to image than soul. Still, she waited, not out of fear or paralysis, but out of strategy. She needed more than suspicion. She needed the truth, whole and undeniable. In the meantime, she played her role flawlessly, supportive, composed, attentive. She poured wine at dinner, asked about his projects, continued to smile at him in public. She became the mirror he had once fallen in love with, but which now only reflected his growing disinterest. Meanwhile, Grace became more than a name. She became a presence. the soft ping of a message after midnight, the unexplained charges from boutique hotels, the new credit card account he had opened without telling her, one she only discovered after casually reviewing a monthly financial report from their shared CPA. Grace Walton, as Selena would later learn, was not just some foolish girl swept up in an affair. She was strategic, ambitious, and deeply embedded in the city's social elite. She was also, perhaps most crucially, already married. The revelation came not through investigation, but by chance. At a charity gala for a local arts foundation, Selena spotted her across the room, light-haired, slim, dressed in a silver gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. She was standing with a tall, distinguished man, who placed a hand on the small of her back as they posed for a photographer. When the announcement came over the speakers introducing District Attorney Jason Walton and his wife, Grace, Selena felt a wave of cold recognition. She did not flinch. She did not leave. She remained through the entire evening, exchanging pleasantries, giving a brief speech, even shaking Jason Walton's hand at the end of the night. On the drive home, Darius asked if she had enjoyed herself. She nodded and turned up the jazz station, letting the music fill the space where her voice might have answered. The following weeks brought further confirmation. She began to trace their movements in her mind, his business trip to Charleston aligning with Grace's conference check-in via a public Instagram post, the boutique hotel near Piedmont Park where he'd booked a suite the same night Grace had a late client dinner tagged in the same district. She collected these moments like glass shards, each one sharper than the last. One night, he came home later than usual. He tried to slip into bed without waking her, but she had been waiting. She asked no questions. She simply moved closer, laid her hand on his chest, and listened to the unfamiliar rhythm of a heart that no longer beat for her. He kissed her forehead. "I love you, you know," he whispered. "I know," she said, but in the darkness her eyes remained open. By the time their second anniversary approached, Darius's affection had become a performance. He planned a weekend getaway to Napa, choosing a vineyard neither of them had ever mentioned, making all the arrangements without asking her preferences. It was clear he was trying to tick a box: romance, obligation, routine. She declined gently, citing work conflicts. He didn't protest. Instead, he took the trip alone. She knew he wouldn't be alone. While he was gone, she stood in the walk-in closet they had remodeled together, her fingers resting on the fabric of a blazer he had recently purchased. The stitching was perfect, the fabric expensive, far above the price point he had once claimed to avoid. She found a folded note in the breast pocket. Just a receipt, innocuous at first glance, but the vendor, a private jewelry designer in Buckhead, was known for custom engagement rings and luxury gifts. The piece purchased was a necklace, rose gold, diamond detail. The inscription, "To a future we don't have to hide." She sat on the floor and held the paper in her lap. Her hands did not tremble. Her heart did not race. She was far past heartbreak. She was ready. When Darius returned, he brought a bottle of wine and stories of how beautiful the landscape had been. He kissed her cheek, told her they needed to take that trip together sometime. "I'd like that," she said with a soft smile. But already she was building something new behind her eyes, something sharp, deliberate, and final. She had given this man everything: her trust, her support, her name. He had mistaken her grace for ignorance, her silence for surrender. Now he would learn the difference. And Grace would soon learn that she was not the only woman in the room who knew how to play a long game. Selena had always believed in the power of waiting, not passive waiting, Not the kind that breeds bitterness or self-pity, but intentional, calculated patience. The kind that allows a storm to gather its strength before it strikes with devastating accuracy. She had spent her career using that very skill, letting opposing counsel underestimate her, allowing witnesses to fumble with their own fabrications until they unraveled themselves. And now, that discipline, honed in courtrooms and boardrooms, was being repurposed for something more personal, more intimate, and far more dangerous. In the quiet days following Darius's return from Napa, she moved through the house like a shadow, saying all the right things, offering small smiles and perfectly timed questions. She praised the wine he brought back. She listened to his stories about vineyards and sunsets. She even leaned into him on the couch during their Friday night movie ritual, her head resting on his shoulder while her mind drifted elsewhere. To the name on the receipt in the jewelry box, to the inscription she could not forget. To a future we don't have to hide. She began her investigation not with confrontation but with structure. She ordered a second phone under a business line, registered under a shell LLC she'd created years ago for privacy. She activated it with a prepaid SIM, one that couldn't be traced back to her or her firm. It would be her tool, her weapon. She didn't want to rely on instinct anymore. She wanted evidence. Irrefutable, documented, chronologically aligned evidence. The first step was hiring someone who could help her move quietly. Her longtime colleague, Sylvia, had once recommended a private investigator after a complex corporate embezzlement case they had handled together. Elena Rodriguez had a law enforcement background and an immaculate record for discretion. More importantly, she had worked with women in high-profile divorces who needed intelligence without scandal. Their first meeting took place in the back office of a nondescript insurance firm Elena used as a cover. The woman was small, muscular, with tightly braided hair and eyes that missed nothing. "This isn't just about cheating," Selena said plainly. "It's about betrayal with intent. I need everything. Timelines, movements, receipts, surveillance if needed. And I need it fast, but quiet. I want them to feel safe until it's too late." Elena nodded once, no questions asked. Back home, Selena resumed her role. She continued hosting dinners, showing up at events with Darius on her arm. She made love to him. She laughed at his jokes. But inside her mind was a filing cabinet. Every detail, every pattern, every deviation from the truth noted and cross-referenced. Within 2 weeks, Elena had a name match. Grace Walton, 33, public relations consultant specializing in healthcare campaigns. Married to Jason Walton, district attorney for Fulton County. No children. Owns a condo in Inman Park and a vacation property on Lake Oconee. No red flags on paper. But photographs told a different story. Elena's team captured the first real proof the following Friday. Darius and Grace walking out of a high-end sushi bar, their hands brushing too familiarly, their body language unmistakable. He opened the door for her. She smiled up at him in that way women do when they believe they are the center of someone's universe. They kissed before pulling apart and disappearing down a corridor behind the restaurant where a private car waited. Selena stared at the pictures for nearly an hour. Not because she didn't believe them, but because she had to digest the reality of what she was looking at. Not an affair born of lust or convenience, but of intention. These were not careless rendezvous. They were planned, coded, protected, just like fraud. She built a dossier. Every hotel receipt was matched to a calendar event where Darius had claimed to be at a conference or a meeting. She compared timestamps from text messages he'd sent her while supposedly working late with geolocation pings from Grace's phone, captured through public metadata. There were dinners, concerts, and even a weekend trip to Asheville that Darius had framed as a silent retreat for creative inspiration. He had lied about everything, but the most stunning revelation came not from Elena's files, but from a slip in conversation. At a networking event for local legal professionals, Selena found herself standing near a group of healthcare executives discussing an upcoming campaign launch. "And Grace Walton's been pushing hard for it," one of them said. "She's good at leveraging high-level contacts. Even got some athlete endorsements lined up, probably through her new guy." "New guy?" someone asked. "Yeah, I think she's planning something big. Heard she's closing down her private client list." Selena's spine stiffened. That night, she dug deeper. Through social connections, she discovered that Grace had indeed begun to withdraw from her PR commitments, citing a new opportunity in private wellness branding. On her social media, carefully curated to reveal just enough, Grace had posted images of vision boards, color palettes, inspirational quotes about freedom, about timing, about destiny. It wasn't just an affair. They were building a life. Together. Selena felt the weight of it settle into her bones. She began gathering her legal documentation. Quietly. She reviewed the prenup clause by clause, marking every point of leverage she still possessed. She documented every instance of financial misconduct, the business accounts Darius had accessed, the transfers he'd initiated without approval, the gifts that could be traced to shared funds. He had underestimated her. He had assumed that because she hadn't reacted, she hadn't noticed, that her silence was weakness, that her grace was ignorance. He had confused stillness with submission, but Selena had not been still. She had been watching, learning, preparing. She built a master file backed up across multiple devices, encrypted and time-stamped. She began making calls, not to gossip, but to position. She spoke to venue managers, to publicists, to trusted colleagues in the nonprofit and legal sectors. She began to shape the evening that would become her coup de grace. The gala would be hosted under the banner of a women's leadership initiative, one she had supported for years. It would be high-profile, strategic, selectively inclusive, and she would ensure that both Darius and Grace were present. The setup was intricate. She arranged for a mutual friend to invite Grace personally, framing it as a chance to network with potential clients for her upcoming rebrand. She suggested Grace bring her husband, Jason Walton, knowing full well that Grace would find a way to come alone. For Darius, the invitation came through a client. He was to present on branding and ethical campaigns, a panel she herself had helped curate. The guest list was curated to include figures from both their social spheres: attorneys, entrepreneurs, donors, media, enough people to ensure what was about to happen could never be whispered away or rewritten. Elena ensured surveillance was ongoing. More images, more documents, audio clips. By the time the event approached, Selena had over 200 pages of documentation. Every movement, every lie, every indulgent word exchanged between her husband and his mistress. She made a timeline, rehearsed her delivery, selected the moment down to the minute when the music would pause and the lights would shift. She purchased the dress she would wear, deep red, floor-length, with sleeves like armor and a neckline that commanded silence. Darius came home 2 nights before the event, humming under his breath as he removed his tie. "You're glowing tonight," he said, wrapping his arms around her waist in the kitchen. "Big case win?" "Something like that," she replied, leaning into him. She let him kiss her. Let him hold her, because in 2 days she would never let him touch her again. He poured them wine and talked about a new campaign he was pitching. She smiled, asked questions, played the part, but inside she was already gone. She watched him talk, this man she had chosen, and wondered how much of him had ever been real. How much had been performance? How long had he been waiting for the right moment to trade her in for a more curated image of success? The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the truth. And in less than 48 hours, the truth would be center stage. Grace would be there. Jason would be there. Darius would walk into the room wearing a suit she had tailored for him, his head held high, never suspecting that he was the one about to be exposed. Not in a whisper, not in a letter, but in front of every person he respected, every connection he had cultivated, every ally he had borrowed from her name. The storm was coming, and this time it had her name etched in thunder. The air in the ballroom was cool and fragrant, laced with hints of white gardenia, citrus, and oak-aged wine. Light from a cascade of chandeliers shimmered off polished mahogany floors and curved along the gold trim of the towering walls. Waiters in pressed black suits moved with silent precision. Trays balanced effortlessly on gloved hands as they distributed champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was perfectly curated, elegant but not excessive, humming with energy but not frenzy. In short, it was a Selina Harris production, timed, orchestrated, and lethal in its beauty. From the outside, this evening resembled a celebration of the city's most promising women leaders, lawyers, founders, physicians, educators. The program listed keynote speakers, dinner menus, silent auction items, and acknowledgments to sponsors who'd been carefully chosen to include several of Darius's professional contacts. It was the kind of event where the right handshake could translate into a contract, where exposure came with a kind of social capital that couldn't be purchased, only earned. For Selina, it was more than a gala. It was a verdict. She arrived early, as always, flanked by 2 staff members from her firm and the event manager she had worked with for the last 5 years. They moved through final preparations like a well-trained unit, checking lighting cues, testing microphones, reviewing table placements. At the center of the ballroom stood the circular dining layout she had insisted on, crafted to maximize visibility from every seat. There would be no corner to hide in, no obscured table to slip away to. Every guest would have a clear view of the stage, and of each other. At precisely 5:30, the guests began to arrive. Selina stood near the entrance in a wine-red gown with structured shoulders and a plunging neckline that suggested control, not seduction. Her makeup was clean and severe, her hair swept into a knot so precise it looked sculpted. As she welcomed each person, her smile never faltered. She was the perfect host. Gracious, warm, engaging. Only someone trained to read beneath the surface would have noticed the steel behind her eyes. Darius arrived just past 6, right on cue. He wore a navy suit with a subtle pinstripe, one she had selected for him last year, tailored to his frame before the first signs of arrogance had crept into his shoulders. He looked handsome, confident, already shaking hands, introducing himself as brand architect and creative strategist. He winked at her across the room and she raised her glass in response. She watched him speak to a group of younger entrepreneurs, his voice animated, his smile infectious. The same smile that had once made her feel chosen. Now it only confirmed what she had come to understand. Some people wore charm like a second skin, not to connect, but to camouflage. At 6:30, Grace Walton entered. She wore emerald green, the exact shade Selena had worn the night she met Darius. It was a bold choice. Maybe a coincidence, maybe a message. The dress hugged her frame in all the ways it was designed to, her hair curled loosely over one shoulder, her skin glowing under the ballroom lights. She paused just inside the doors, scanning the room, her eyes alert and measuring. Selena watched her calculate who to greet first, which conversation to join, how to stand and laugh and listen. Jason Walton arrived 15 minutes later, his expression polished and unreadable. He made his rounds with diplomatic poise, pausing to greet colleagues, to exchange pleasantries with judges and professors, then joined Grace at their designated table. Not with intimacy, but obligation. They barely touched. Grace laughed too loudly at someone else's story while Jason scrolled briefly through his phone. By 7, the room was full. The hum of conversation had thickened into a vibrant energy. Behind the curtain near the stage, Selena took a deep breath. Elena had delivered the final photos that morning. Images of Darius and Grace in a luxury suite at the St. James Hotel 2 nights prior. There was no room left for doubt, only exposure. She stepped onto the stage as the lights dimmed, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. Applause greeted her, not roaring, but steady, respectful. She stood tall behind the podium, glancing once toward the center table where Darius and Grace sat beside Jason. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm, even. "Tonight, we are gathered to honor women who lead, women who rise, women who tell the truth, even when it is inconvenient, unpopular, or painful." A slight pause. She smiled. "But truth, you see, is not always about speeches or public wins. Sometimes truth hides in silence, in the cracks of stories we tell ourselves to stay comfortable." Around the room, chairs shifted, wine glasses lowered, the air changed. "And sometimes," she continued, "the greatest act of leadership is not building something. It is refusing to let it rot from the inside." She nodded to the technician. A screen lit up behind her, elegant and large. The first image appeared, Darius standing at a valet station, his hand on Grace's waist. Their heads were tilted toward each other, lips nearly touching. Gasps rippled across the room. Some guests turned to each other, others stared forward in stunned silence. At the table, Darius froze. Grace's face drained of color. Jason sat still, eyes locked on the screen, his jaw clenched. More images followed, each one time-stamped, geolocated, documented. Darius and Grace entering hotel lobbies, sharing dinner, kissing on a balcony, walking through a market hand in hand, laughing. "No one wants to believe they're being deceived," Selena said, her voice now colder, harder, "especially by those they've trusted most. But deception thrives in silence, and I've never been one to stay quiet when the truth demands to be heard." She turned slightly, facing the table directly. "Darius Bell, my husband, the man I built a life beside, and Grace Walton, wife of District Attorney Jason Walton. Two people who chose to rewrite the meaning of loyalty while pretending to honor its name." Murmurs surged through the room. Grace stood suddenly, then sat back down as her heel caught in the table linen. Darius reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. "I present this not for vengeance," Selena said, "but for clarity, for anyone who ever doubted that silence equals complicity, for every woman told to keep her voice low and her pride lower." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I'm not that woman, and this is not that night." Applause broke like a crack of thunder, scattered at first, then building. Some stood, others sat in stunned disbelief. Jason rose from his seat and walked out without a word. Grace followed seconds later, her hand covering her mouth. Darius remained seated, his head bowed, his hands limp in his lap. Selena stepped down from the stage, her body vibrating with adrenaline, but her expression unbothered. She greeted donors, spoke briefly to reporters, thanked her team. She walked the ballroom like a queen returning from war, untouched and unbent. Later, in the parking lot, Darius approached her. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. She turned slowly, meeting his eyes with cool detachment. "That," she said, "was the truth, delivered precisely. You destroyed me." "No," she said, "you did that. I just turned on the lights." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, low and bitter. "You're cold." "No," she repeated. "I'm finished." She left him standing in the shadows of the venue, his suit wrinkled, his ego shattered, the future he had imagined with another woman collapsing before his eyes. The storm had passed, and all that remained was aftermath. The days following the gala descended into chaos, though not for Selena. For her, it was a season of stillness. Not peace, not yet, but stillness. The kind that comes when a forest has already burned and the ash is settling quietly over the blackened soil. She moved through her routine with the same precise grace that had always defined her, arriving early to the office, reviewing case files with methodical focus, hosting afternoon consultations with poised authority. But around her, the world Darius had so carefully constructed was unraveling thread by thread. It began the morning after the event. Videos had surfaced overnight. Shaky phone footage of her speech, screenshots of the photographs, whisper and audio captured through hushed gasps. The story spread quickly, first in private group chats, then in broader social networks. Blogs picked it up. Professional forums dissected the ethics, the audacity, the precision. By noon, a local lifestyle columnist published a thinly veiled essay about betrayal and brand identity that quoted Selena's closing remarks without naming names. But everyone in their world already knew. Darius's phone exploded with calls he didn't answer. Sponsors withdrew. Clients quietly canceled meetings. A week later, a tech startup that had been in negotiations with his agency released a statement citing a shift in strategic direction, effectively ending what would have been his largest contract to date. He showed up at the house one evening, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot behind designer sunglasses he hadn't removed even as dusk fell. He didn't knock, just used his key, one Selena had not yet bothered to deactivate. She met him in the foyer, arms folded, posture immovable. "I need to talk," he said, voice hoarse. "Please." She let him in, not out of softness, but out of protocol. Let him speak, let him hang himself further with his own words. He walked into the living room, looked around like a man returning to a place he once owned but now rented in memory. The home hadn't changed. It was still immaculate, warm in its minimalism, full of quiet art and curated books, but it no longer felt like his. That truth lived in the air, in the way Selena didn't sit beside him, didn't pour him a drink, didn't ask if he was hungry. She stood while he sat. "I made a mistake," he began, "a big one." She didn't respond. "I didn't mean to hurt you like that." Still, she said nothing. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. Grace, he paused, struggling. It got out of hand. She tilted her head. Got out of hand? Like a budget overage or a poorly scheduled campaign? His jaw clenched. "You know what I mean." "No," she said softly. "I don't think I do. Because from where I'm standing, you built a second life. That takes planning, intention, time." He looked away. "I lost everything," he muttered. "Clients, reputation, my entire business is collapsing." She stepped closer then, her voice quiet but sharp. You lost what you stole. Don't confuse that with ownership. He rose, chest heaving. I gave so much to this marriage. She laughed, short and low. You gave performance. I gave you access. And you leveraged it. You treated our marriage like a ladder, and when you thought you'd climbed high enough, you kicked the base out from under you. He stared at her, defiant. You think you're better than me. I know I am, she replied, not with arrogance, but with finality. Then why did you marry me? He asked. She considered this for a moment, really considered it. Because I thought you loved me. And I was ready to believe that love didn't need to be earned through suffering, that maybe, finally, I could rest. He didn't speak again. She handed him a manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers already filed. The terms were clear, reinforced by the prenuptial agreement he had signed with such false confidence years before. He would keep nothing. No portion of her assets, no claim on the house, no residual rights to the investments he had helped spend but not build. Legally, he was entitled only to what he had entered with, and that, as it turned out, was very little. By the end of the week, the fallout had gone public. The local business journal ran a feature on ethical collapse and startup leadership, highlighting unnamed but easily identifiable examples. One former investor openly stated during a podcast interview that Darius Bell had lost credibility in the market and could not be trusted with brand stewardship. Internally, former staff began sharing stories of disorganization, mismanagement, unpaid invoices. What Selena had exposed was only the beginning. The rot went deeper. And Grace had vanished. After the gala, she had reportedly left Atlanta for a wellness retreat somewhere along the Florida coast. Jason Walton filed for divorce within 48 hours of the event, citing infidelity and misappropriation of shared funds. His legal team began investigating every account under Grace's name, which led to a separate thread of scandal. Payments traced back to her PR firm revealed a pattern of fraudulent billing, ghost clients, inflated hours, invoices for work that had never existed. Selena's attorney received confirmation that federal charges were pending. For the first time in months, Selena allowed herself to sit in the garden with a glass of wine and breathe. Not deeply, not yet, but without the constant pressure of pretense. She stared at the stone pathway that Darius had once helped lay, now partly covered in moss, and felt neither anger nor grief, just clarity. She listed the house the following week. The process was efficient. Stagers came and went. Photographers captured the curated warmth. Buyers submitted offers within days. The property sold above asking. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even walk through it one last time. She moved into a sleek apartment in the city. Glass walls, concrete floors, clean lines. Everything was hers, every object deliberately chosen, every corner free of echoes. There was no room for ghosts. Back at her firm, referrals surged. Women came to her not just for legal representation, but for guidance. Some arrived shaken, unsure whether their suspicions meant anything. Others brought files, recordings, receipts of double lives. They spoke in code with embarrassment, but Selena understood all the languages of betrayal. She listened. She asked the right questions. She helped them not only win, but recover. Her practice evolved. She created a new division, matrimonial forensics. It combined investigative diligence with compassionate counsel. Clients left her office feeling steadier. Not saved. She didn't pretend to be anyone's savior, but seen. Occasionally, she'd hear murmurs of Darius attempting to rebuild, pitching watered-down versions of past campaigns under new names, emailing former clients under a different LLC. But the industry was small and memory longer than ambition. No one returned his calls. He drifted through lesser circles, chasing temporary contracts that dissolved as quickly as they formed. One evening, she spotted him across a cafe courtyard. He was sitting alone, nursing a black coffee, eyes behind dark glasses. He didn't see her. She watched for a moment, then turned and walked away. There was nothing left to say. He had wanted a kingdom without building foundations. He had borrowed her crown, then tried to replace the queen. But there are some thrones that cannot be inherited, only earned. And he had nothing of his own. The new apartment sat 30 floors above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows casting a wide view over the skyline, where the distant hum of sirens and the flicker of headlights moved like quiet memories. Selina often stood at the glass late at night, barefoot, a silk robe tied loosely around her waist. The lights behind her dimmed to a golden glow. There was a strange freedom in being alone in a space so open, so unhidden. No footsteps to anticipate, no whispered lies to decode, no need to play the role of the accommodating wife who sensed everything and said nothing. The past few months had rearranged everything she had once tethered herself to. Her marriage, which she'd believed was rooted in partnership, had revealed itself as a polished illusion. Her home, once a sanctuary of achievement, was now someone else's listing. Her name, however, had survived the fire and come out refined. Her work grew deeper, more intentional. Clients who had once viewed her as a skilled attorney now regarded her as a figure of unwavering resolve. Someone who had lived the storm and documented the fallout with clarity. Women in high-net-worth marriages, women caught in manipulative partnerships, women afraid of leaving with nothing but their dignity. They came to her not just for contracts or representation, but for courage. She accepted them all with limits. She did not promise rescue. She offered process, truth, strategy. She taught them how to reclaim not just their assets, but their narrative. And in that, she began to see the shape of something new in herself, something fiercer, leaner, and less inclined to accommodate what didn't serve her soul. It was during a deposition for one of these clients, a hedge fund partner, married to an emotionally abusive surgeon, that she first crossed paths with Desmond Carter. He was not flashy. He entered the room with little fanfare, a charcoal gray suit, scuffed briefcase, no entourage, but his presence landed like a bass note in a silent room, calm, steady, observant. He represented the opposing party, but his demeanor was unusual. Curt, yes, but never cruel. When he questioned Selina's client, he did so with surgical precision, but without mockery. When he addressed Selina, his gaze held no challenge, only understanding, mutual recognition. After the deposition, they left the conference room at the same time. She hadn't meant to walk beside him, but the elevator was slow and they ended up shoulder to shoulder in the long hallway outside the firm's offices. He broke the silence first. "You're not what they say," he said, glancing at her. She lifted an eyebrow. "What do they say?" He shrugged. "That you're ruthless, cold, dangerous to cross." She smiled without mirth. "And what do you think?" "I think they're projecting." He paused. "A woman who can't be manipulated becomes a villain to the ones who tried." She turned toward him. "And which one are you?" He considered it. "Neither. I just believe in doing my job. Doesn't mean I have to be a bastard while doing it." That was all. He stepped into the elevator and she remained behind, but his words stayed with her longer than she cared to admit. A few weeks later, they met again. this time at a law symposium hosted at the university where she had once guest lectured. He was on a panel about ethical litigation. She was a keynote speaker on strategic advocacy and family law. Their conversations grew longer, layered. They didn't flirt. There was no rush. Just exchanges about the courts, about failure, about how justice sometimes wore the wrong face. It was in these moments she began to sense the faint possibility of something she hadn't thought possible again: trust without sacrifice. Desmond never asked her about Darius. If he had read the articles, seen the footage, he never let on. He treated her not as a headline, not as a woman scorned, but as a peer. Equal footing. No pedestal, no agenda. He invited her to lunch one afternoon, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she said yes. They met at a small restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a florist, the kind of place you didn't find unless someone who cared brought you there. Over grilled halibut and black rice, he asked about her practice, her new division, her thoughts on how the court handled emotional labor and spousal settlements. And then, after a long pause, he said, "Do you ever miss him?" The question landed like a soft blow. She didn't answer immediately. "I don't miss who he was," she finally said. "I miss who I thought I was when I loved him." Desmond nodded. "That makes sense." The meal ended without fanfare. He walked her to her car, didn't ask for a number, didn't touch her hand. But he looked at her like he saw all of it, and didn't flinch. That night, standing in front of her window, the skyline humming below, Selena thought about the weight of her name. Not just the name printed on her business cards or etched into plaques, but the legacy of her choices. The name that had once felt like an anchor now felt like a banner. A name she had reclaimed, not from marriage or from media, but from within herself. She'd never been defined by Darius. She'd merely allowed herself to be shaped around him, sculpted to fit a space he'd never truly earned. But she had stepped out of that mold, and now nothing he had touched defined her, not even the damage. Her friends had changed too. Some disappeared after the gala, their silence a quiet betrayal. Others drew closer, bringing wine and laughter and fierce loyalty. Her closest friend, Marlene, sat with her one evening over a fire pit on the balcony, both of them wrapped in blankets, sipping dark red wine. "You know what scares men about you?" Marlene said, eyes on the flames. "What?" "You don't need their story to finish your own." Selena smiled. "I used to think I needed a shared ending. Now I realize I only ever needed my own pages." She didn't call Desmond. But when he reached out, first through a thoughtful article, then an invitation to a discussion panel, she didn't hesitate to respond. They weren't building a romance. Not yet. But there was something unfolding. A slow return to human connection. One that didn't cost her pieces of herself. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No apologies, no demands. Just 5 words. "You were never the mistake." No signature, but she didn't need one. She folded it once, then twice, and placed it in a drawer in her nightstand. Not out of sentimentality, but as proof. Not all endings required shouting. Some were just quiet acknowledgments that a page had truly turned. She stopped checking the news for updates on Grace's trial. She had already known how it would end. Some people collapsed under truth, others simply disappeared. Selena chose neither. She rose. Each morning, she walked into her firm with her head high. Her name, unshared, unbound, now stood on its own at the front of the building. Harris and Associates. No initials, no hyphen, no trace of a man who had tried to use her as a springboard into a future that wasn't his to claim. Clients still came. Stories still arrived, raw and familiar, and she kept listening, kept building. In the reflection of her office window, she no longer saw the woman who had been betrayed. She saw the architect of her own resurrection, and her name, on lips whispered with admiration, with fear, with reverence, meant something again. It meant she had survived. It meant she had rewritten the narrative. It meant she had won. Autumn descended on Atlanta with the quiet authority of change. Leaves turned deep amber, the sky cooled to a soft blue-gray, and the air carried a subtle sharpness that hinted at endings. For Selena, the season mirrored everything she felt but no longer needed to say aloud. It had been nearly a year since the night she had laid truth bare beneath the chandeliers of a gala stage, and though time had moved with mechanical precision, healing did not obey such order. It arrived like fog, slow and without warning, slipping into her lungs until she realized she could finally breathe without flinching. Her mornings began earlier now, not out of urgency, but out of intention. She found solace in the small rituals, steeping her tea just so, reading court opinions with the sunrise bleeding through her windows, tying her hair back with fingers that no longer trembled. She had learned to live without noise, without a second voice weaving into her own. And the silence no longer threatened her. It comforted her. In her practice, she had become a quiet legend. Harris and Associates grew not because of advertising or aggressive marketing, but through reputation alone. Other attorneys referred their most complex cases to her. Judges spoke her name with cautious respect. Opposing counsel treated her with a kind of reverence usually reserved for retired war generals, those who had fought, survived, and returned more dangerous for having done so. Her division, the one she had created to support women disentangling from lives built around deception, now accounted for nearly a third of the firm's caseload. She had assembled a team of equally sharp, deeply empathetic professionals, attorneys, investigators, forensic accountants, trauma consultants. Together, they not only won cases, they restored balance. And yet, for all her success, Selena never allowed herself the comfort of denial. She knew that empowerment did not mean immunity, that her pain had not been a singular tragedy but one thread in a vast tapestry of stories woven through centuries of silence, expectation, and theft. What Darius had done was neither extraordinary nor unique. That was what made it so unforgivable. Still, she did not become bitter. Bitterness was a cheap armor, and she had never needed pretense to be strong. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon, one that blurred the city into a watercolor of traffic lights and reflections when she saw him again. Not in person, but in an article sent to her by a colleague. The headline was stark. From branding star to lawsuit defendant, the slow fall of Darius Bell. The piece chronicled his descent with the cold elegance of fact, failed ventures, a civil suit filed by a former investor, a misdemeanor charge related to falsified consulting fees. His personal life, the article said, had become increasingly volatile. Anonymous sources noted his temper, his isolation, his erratic pitches to companies who no longer took his calls. She read it twice, not out of glee, but out of study. It wasn't that she needed to see him fall. She had already let him go, but confirmation had its own form of closure. It affirmed that truth, when left unburied, continued to work long after it had been spoken. Later that evening, she sat in her study, surrounded by soft jazz and the gentle tapping of rain against glass, when her assistant forwarded a message from the front desk. A walk-in client. No appointment, but insistent. She rarely entertained such requests, but something in the timing, The quiet pull of curiosity led her to agree. The woman who stepped into her office looked composed but frayed at the edges. Mid-30s, well-dressed, hands clasped too tightly. Her name was Clara. Her story began the way so many did, with love, with sacrifice, with promises. And then came the lies, the gaslighting, the slow erosion of identity. Her husband had hidden debts, a mistress, a second phone. She had proof, but no courage. She didn't know where to begin. Selena listened, nodding occasionally, offering no platitudes. When Clara finished, her voice a whisper of exhaustion, Selena leaned forward. "You are not broken," she said calmly. "You are standing. And standing is the beginning of power." Clara's lip quivered. She didn't cry, but her shoulders straightened, as if just being believed had pulled her upright. After Clara left with a folder of options and a scheduled consultation, Selena walked to the window and looked out at the city. She thought of how many more would come, how many women lived in beautiful homes filled with secrets, how many were told their suspicions were hysteria, how many stayed silent to keep the peace that never truly existed. She would not save them all. But she would be ready when they arrived. Desmond had called earlier that week suggesting dinner. She hadn't responded yet, not because she didn't want to go, but because she no longer needed to fill the empty spaces with another person. She was learning to leave space unoccupied, to let her own voice echo long enough to recognize it again. Still, she smiled when she saw his name. Maybe she'd call him back tomorrow. The city moved beneath her like a current, uncaring but constant. People changed addresses, changed names, changed stories. But some truths, once spoken, lived forever. And her truth was simple. She had been used, but not diminished. She'd been betrayed, but not erased. She had been abandoned, but not broken. In the end, when the fire burned out and the smoke cleared, it was her name that still stood. Not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a banner of endurance. The woman who stayed standing, not because she had to, because she chose to. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories and share this one with someone who needs to see it.